The day started just like any other, with the usual morning chaos and the delightful clatter of breakfast dishes. But there was a particularly unsettling letter waiting for me on the kitchen counter. It was our latest electricity bill, which had unexpectedly skyrocketed. Concerned and a bit alarmed, I dialed the power company's customer service in a rush. After explaining the situation, they promptly sent over an employee to investigate. The young man arrived with a toolbox and a clipboard, looking ready to solve any mystery. As he scanned around our house, his eyes suddenly narrowed in confusion. "Did you notice this wire before?" he asked, pointing towards our outdoor outlet. "Bob, my husband, and I rushed over to see what he was talking about." The employee, without hesitation, gently moved a potted plant nearby to give us a clearer view. To our surprise, a strange wire extended from our outlet, snaking its way toward my in-laws' house next door. "Do you know anything about this wire?" the power company employee asked. Bob and I exchanged glances, probably both thinking the same thing. "Hey, Bob, could this be?" I started to ask. "Yeah, no doubt about it," he replied firmly. "This is why our electric bill went through the roof." Almost instinctively, Bob reached for the outlet and swiftly unplugged the wire. The very next moment, a sharp scream echoed from the direction of my in-laws' house. "What in the world?" I muttered. It was probably my mother-in-law. Soon after, I could hear some hysterical muttering. The voice grew louder, coming from behind their door and heading our way. Suddenly, my mother-in-law burst out from the bushes, looking both startled and slightly embarrassed. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Mary Johnson, a 32-year-old stay-at-home mom with a hobby of trying out limited-time desserts. I always gather information about desserts either through friends or by doing my own research. Bob, my kind husband who's the same age as me, always supports my hobbies. We've known each other since college. I've always adored Bob for his consistent kindness. I also had a deep fondness for my in-laws, who raised such a wonderful man. Many of my married friends often complain about issues with their mothers-in-law. I've even heard stories about marriages ending due to in-law troubles. But thankfully, such tales have nothing to do with our household. Like me, my mother-in-law is a fan of desserts. Whenever I bring her a recommended treat, she's always delighted. My father-in-law, though a man of few words, always has a reassuring smile. Both of them have always been fond of me, and I felt the same about them. My in-laws currently live about a 30-minute drive away, not too close, but not too far, just the right distance. But sometimes, I wonder. With the two of them, maybe we could live together. It's not that I want to live together, but perhaps we might get along even better than expected. I adored my in-laws enough to even entertain the idea of living together, but I'd come to realize that life isn't always that sweet. One day, Bob threw me off with some unexpected news. Guess what? Your parents, turns out they're moving into the vacant house next door. I had always assumed they owned their place, but it seems they were actually renting. Their old house had gotten too worn down, and when they found out about the empty house next to ours, they jumped on the opportunity. It was a sudden, short-distance move, and I was immediately consumed by anxiety. Up until now, I'd gotten along with my in-laws without any major issues, but living next door meant we could potentially see each other every day. While I liked my in-laws, the prospect of seeing them daily felt overwhelming. But it's not like I could suddenly say it was too close and ask them not to move here. Actually, when we heard about the move, Bob gently advised his parents, "Maybe you shouldn't." But they didn't want to hear it, insisting, "We get along so well now, it'll be fine." I wanted to smack my overly optimistic self for ever thinking we could live together without issues. As my anxiety grew, my in-laws moved in. We greeted them cautiously, and at first, things seemed okay. We maintained a good distance and set some boundaries. But as they started to feel more at home, my mother-in-law began to push those boundaries like never before. She epitomized every "don't do this" behavior you hear about. Dropping by without calling ahead became her usual routine, and once she was in, she'd act as if it were her own house. Not only that, but it felt like they were monitoring our every move. Then, on the day my mother-in-law paid an unannounced visit and checked on our dinner, she said something absolutely outrageous. "Hey, Mary, I've been thinking, maybe you could stop locking the door." I couldn't believe my ears. Can you believe it? In this day and age, she's suggesting I leave our house unlocked. Not locking the door means not knowing who could walk in at any time. That's just not comforting. Ever since my mother-in-law moved in nearby, even the sound of the doorbell makes my heart race. Now, there's the possibility she could just walk into our home without us even knowing. I'm certainly not okay with that. With how things are lately, I have to admit, not locking the door feels kind of scary. Trying to keep things light has become a daily challenge. I declined her suggestion with a smile, but she frowned and replied, "Oh Mary, you're such a worrier, but don't fret. I'll tell our neighbors to look out for you, and don't forget, your father-in-law and I are here too. We'll be popping in frequently." I understand that her words come from a good place, and I appreciate that. That's why I couldn't bring myself to tell her how burdensome her frequent visits had become. But everyone has their limits. Last week, it felt like she had perfect attendance at our home. I have tea with my mother-in-law at our home every day. Naturally, spending this much time together, it's no wonder some grievances arise. I've come to truly understand that a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship is all about the right distance. She would leave unnecessary potted plants in our yard or plant flowers without asking. It's like she does whatever she wants now. If it was once every few months, I could tolerate it, but every day is a different story. Since the locking incident, she's brought it up several times. I managed to convince her by saying I was just a wife with strong security concerns. However, with that settled, my mother-in-law then started pleading for a spare key. I knew I had to get Bob to refuse her request. Handing such a powerful item to her now is just out of the question. Though I found myself at odds with how she behaves, I didn't quite dislike her. She can be meddlesome, but I know it comes from my mother-in-law's good intentions. Rather, I felt more guilt for rejecting her than anything else. But as time passed, those feelings began to change. Whether it was me changing, my mother-in-law changing, or both, I can't be sure. However, I started to feel discomfort and irritation with her comments. It was a few months after she moved in, and by then it had become a routine for my mother-in-law to visit after lunch. I once asked about my father-in-law, and it seems he usually goes for walks or shopping alone. I suggested she should join him, but she declined, saying, "Walking tires me out." Lately, she's become a typical mother-in-law. Previously, when I made her tea, she'd just say thank you, but now there's always a comment like it's too warm or it's weak. Whenever she speaks, it's either gossip or bad-mouthing someone. Being around her just brings me down, but I can't exactly reject her, so I just nod and force a smile. It's just not good. The grass keeps growing, and they never cut it. I've even thought about mowing it myself. Today, my mother-in-law was fervently discussing a neighbor's consistently neglected yard, so I was saying, "Oh," when my mother-in-law suddenly stopped talking. I instinctively followed her gaze to the bookshelf. Did she find a book that piqued her interest? It'd be peaceful if we could just read together. Did you find a book you're interested in? I asked as I was about to approach the bookshelf. She reached past it, grabbing something from the rack next to it. "Susan, you shouldn't touch that," she exclaimed. Upon seeing what she took, I hastily reached out, but she just innocently opened it. Then she exclaimed with delight, "Oh my, Mary dear, oh dear, didn't you overspend last month? Goodness, your electricity bill is twice as much as ours." What my mother-in-law was looking at, as if she were reading a weekly magazine, was our household account book. "Stop, give it back." I hurriedly snatched it away. My mother-in-law laughed softly. "You really don't have to be so flustered. But, Mary, it seems like you're not so good at saving money. Bob must feel bad having a wife who struggles with budgeting. You should try a bit harder, okay?" I could feel my face heat up. Both the front and back covers clearly stated the household account book. Still, she took the plunge and opened someone else's household account book. I couldn't believe it. And about those desserts, she continued, I have a soft spot for limited edition treats too, so I get the urge. But if you can't even save a dime, do you think you really deserve to indulge in sweets? Furthermore, my mother-in-law kept on nagging, saying things like, you spend way too much on food, and the electricity bill is outrageous. On top of that, she boasted about how frugal she was. After ranting for a while, she seemed satisfied and left. After my mother-in-law left, I was so moved that I couldn't stop crying. The accumulated stress might have played a part. 2. I've reached my breaking point. I cried nonstop until Bob came home. You don't have to take Mom's word for it, but I think it's easier said than done. I'm really sorry. I'll tell Mom not to come again. Yeah, please, I managed through my tears. Bob comforted me, and after our conversation, I felt a slight relief knowing he understood. But the damage was done. My relationship with my mother-in-law had fundamentally changed. The trust and warmth I once felt were now overshadowed by her overbearing nature and lack of respect for our privacy. I knew things had to change, and soon. After calming down a bit from the earlier distress, I decided to discuss something that had been weighing heavily on my mind, the electricity bill. As my mother-in-law had not so subtly pointed out, it was alarmingly high. Despite no significant changes in our usage, it had skyrocketed over the past few months. I was deeply concerned, but dealing with my mother-in-law's invasive behaviors had left me little time to think about much else. Bob looked over the details of the electricity bill, equally puzzled. This is definitely strange, he commented. I know, right? The next bill is coming soon, isn't it? If it seems off, we should definitely call the electric company, I replied, feeling a sense of urgency. A few days later, another bill arrived, charging us an astonishing $1,300, more than double our usual amount. Feeling that something was amiss, we hurriedly decided to have someone from the electric company come over to investigate. The technician from the electric company took a detailed look around our property. After a while, he called us over and pointed out something peculiar. Did you know about this wire? As Bob and I approached, the technician gently moved a potted plant to make it visible to us. It was hidden by the long leaves, but there was an external outlet there, one we'd forgotten about since we'd never used it since building the house. From that outlet, as the technician mentioned, a wire extended, leading towards my in-laws' house. Do you know anything about this wire? He asked. At the technician's question, Bob and I exchanged glances. We were both likely thinking the same thing. Hey, Bob, could this be? Yeah, no doubt about it. This is the reason our electric bill shot up. To be sure, we followed the wire with the technician, pushing through bushes and tall weeds. Sure enough, the wire led to my in-laws' storage shed. We couldn't see where it connected from here, but it was clear that it had something to do with the in-laws' house. The technician, with a stern look, asked, Do you want me to call the police? No, we might have to, but let's talk it out first. This house belongs to our parents, after all. The worker initially looked tense, suspecting theft of electricity, but upon realizing it was a family home, his expression softened with relief. Oh, I see. I'll be on my way then. Yes, thank you for taking the time to come out here. We really appreciate it, I said gratefully. We walked him out to his vehicle and saw him off. After he left, we turned to each other, deep in thought. Bob sighed heavily, cradling his head in his hands. This unexpected discovery added a new layer of complexity to our already strained relationship with the in-laws, and we knew we had to confront them about it. However, the thought of how to approach the subject without causing further conflict weighed heavily on us. I'm sorry for having a mother like that, Bob muttered, his voice tinged with frustration and disbelief. It's hard to say, don't worry about it. What are we going to do next? If it was like any other day, Bob's parents were probably home right now. Should we confront them directly, or should we come up with a plan first? I pondered aloud. Bob, with his hand covering his mouth, started walking towards the external outlet. Thanks to the employee who had moved the potted plant aside earlier, the outlet was clearly visible. As we approached it, a troubling thought crossed my mind. Perhaps his mother had purposefully placed the potted plant here to hide this outlet. Though I hated to suspect, I couldn't think of any other reason. I wondered what this wire was connected to. Suddenly, Bob reached out and swiftly unplugged the wire. "Wait, is it okay to unplug that?" I asked, startled by his abrupt action. "I just unplugged it." "Thinking of them calmly stealing our electricity all this time makes me so angry," Bob responded, his jaw set in determination. "Anyway, we have the employee as a witness. I won't let them make any lame excuses if need be." "We have that as well." "That's true," I nodded in agreement when suddenly a high-pitched scream rang out from Bob's parents' house, probably my mother-in-law's. Moments later, hysterical muttering was heard. The voices came out of their door and started heading in our direction. And then, with great momentum, my mother-in-law burst out from behind the hedge. What? She must not have expected anyone to be there. When my mother-in-law saw us, she let out a deeply surprised voice. "No, I'm surprised you guys. What are you doing in a place like that?" she snapped at us. So, I puffed up my chest and responded, "Susan, do you have some business in our yard? You seemed pretty flustered, didn't you?" "Well, that's..." She looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Beyond her, Bob was holding on to the removed wire firmly. When my mother-in-law exclaimed, "Oh," she tried to snatch it from Bob's hand. Bob twisted away, hiding the wire behind his back. "Hey, what are you doing?" "No, that's what I should be asking you." Bob thrust the wire in front of her face and said in a deep, serious voice, "This was plugged into our outlet, you know," emphasizing the R. My mother-in-law's eyes darted around for a moment, then she looked upwards defensively. "So what? Do you know where this wire goes?" "I have no idea. Just plug it back in now. Things are a mess here since you pulled it out." How could she ask to plug it in without even knowing where it's connected to? Plus, she's basically admitting she suffered because it was unplugged. It's almost like she's confessing. She did it, but my mother-in-law didn't seem the least bit guilty, she was just completely panicked. Standing next to Bob, I smiled reassuringly. "Susan, please calm down. How can we plug in a wire when we don't know where it leads? This is our outlet, isn't it? It's no big deal to plug it in, it's just for a moment, so please." "Oh Susan, remember what you told me about not wasting even a bit of electricity? How Bob was unfortunate to have a wife who couldn't even save on electricity." That was when she started to fidget. "I won't make it in time," I heard her mutter under her breath, seeming on the verge of panicking. "What time is it now?" I asked. "Well, it's 9:57. "Oh no, I'm done for." After that exclamation, my mother-in-law stumbled all the way hurriedly and left. Bob was puzzled by his mother's strange behavior, and I knew the reason behind it. I whispered to Bob, "Is that what you mean? So if we keep hanging around like this, she'll show up again." "That's right," Bob said, tossing the wire aside, and we headed back inside the house. A short while later, I heard a rattling sound at the front door, followed by the doorbell ringing. This was my mother-in-law. I unlocked the door and opened it. "Hello, Susan." Continuing from what I said earlier. "Enough of your chatter, move over." As soon as the door opened, my mother-in-law pushed me aside and entered. She was visibly upset, her footsteps thundered like a monster's as she made her way to the living room and then heavily flopped onto the sofa. Bob, who was in the living room, furrowed his brows with a puzzled expression and was about to speak, but my mother-in-law was a tad quicker. "Oh, I'm parched. Hey, is the tea not ready yet? You're so slow. Act before being told, that's basic etiquette, right?" Yes, and another thing, why do you always lock the door? Everyone in the neighborhood says I have a cold daughter-in-law. There's nothing worth stealing in this house anyway. It's just so pretentious. It's annoying, she continued to grumble. Oh, this is hopeless. I can't stand it anymore, I said as I grabbed the half-drunk plastic bottle nearby and slammed it down on the table in front of my mother-in-law. She sat there, her eyes wide and frozen in shock. Mary, here you are, your water. And you said there's nothing worth stealing in this house, but sadly, there are greedy and sneaky people out there. For example, people who sneakily steal electricity. I could see the panic on my mother-in-law's face as I sat right next to her. Despite my proximity, she didn't have the courage to look at me. She just stared before her, her face pale. Mary, what's wrong? You don't seem like yourself, she ventured tentatively. Really, Susan, even I have my limits. Did you think I was a god or something? I tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but she was as frightened as if she had seen a demon. My mother-in-law turned to Bob for help, but he just shook his head. Next to her was her daughter-in-law, who had turned into a demon in her eyes, and a few feet away was Bob, who was unwilling to help her given the circumstances. My mother-in-law's next move was predictable. I'm sorry, I remembered that I have something to do, so I'm going to go. You're not going anywhere, are you? I pushed on my mother-in-law's shoulder hard as she tried to get up from the couch. Her back sank deep into the sofa. Mary, I really need to. You were the one who said you were thirsty, weren't you? You made such a fuss, and now you say you can't drink water. That's pretty hypocritical, don't you think? Tears filled her eyes as she reached for her bottle, but this time, Bob stopped her. My mother-in-law seemed relieved for a moment, but she didn't want me to drink the leftover. The real problem begins now. When did you start stealing our electricity? You often accuse me of stealing, and that's a terrible thing to say. But the wire that's plugged into my outlet actually comes from your house, right? My mother-in-law couldn't come up with a good excuse and opened and closed her mouth several times, wondering if she could somehow bluff her way out of the situation. To be honest, she had no way out of this. Is she stupid? All she had to do now was admit it and apologize. I thought so, but it seemed like fate had thrown my mother-in-law a lifeline. The doorbell rang. So, when I went to see, it was my father-in-law. Is Susan here? Apparently, my father-in-law had gone out for a bit of shopping. When he returned home, the front door was not locked, and the TV was still on, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. He must have been worried. David, seeing her lifeline, my mother-in-law ran to him, tears streaming down her face. My father-in-law seemed quite embarrassed by his wife's distraught appearance. That's when Bob stepped in and explained everything from the start. After thinking for a while, my father-in-law began to speak slowly, clearly struggling with the revelation. Isn't there some kind of mistake? Of course, he would find it hard to believe that his own wife had been secretly stealing electricity from their son's house. Then who did the wiring? Do you think a complete stranger would go through the trouble of connecting someone else's wiring to another person's house? He crossed his arms, deep in thought, then nodded and said, "Let's go and have a look first," and stood up. However, my mother-in-law, clearly flustered and trying to intervene, exclaimed. Despite this, my father-in-law asked Bob to show him what was happening and walked towards the power outlet. The wiring seemed to trail off into a storage shed and couldn't be seen from where they were. When my father-in-law investigated and returned, the color had drained from his face. "I'm so sorry, I truly am. Apologize to them now," he said to my mother-in-law, who, like a chastised child, murmured, "I'm sorry." My father-in-law explained that the wires went to a battery and were connected to my mother-in-law's computer via an extension cord. The battery was purchased when she moved to the new house, not only for emergencies, but apparently a salesman told her it's cost-effective to store electricity during the cheaper nighttime hours and then use it during the day. And my mother-in-law actually did it. She used the house's electrical outlet to store electricity at night and used it in her home during the day. At first, that was all she did, but her extension cord had an unused socket, so she apparently started plugging in her computer and other home appliances. Eventually, she started receiving electricity from our house all day, not just at night. My mother-in-law justified her actions by saying, "I heard it was more economical." Naturally, I was annoyed that she was stealing the electricity without permission, but what made me even more angry was that, despite my mother-in-law's constant criticism and belittling towards me, she was lying the entire time. "You often said how Bob is so unlucky to have a wife who can't save money, and how I buy sweets but can't even save a dime, didn't you?" That's true, isn't it? Her lack of remorse was considerable. Just saving money on your electricity bill by using someone else's electricity doesn't mean you're saving money, that's just theft, I continued. "And just so you know, I won't let this slide just because we're family. If you don't sincerely apologize, we'll have no choice but to involve the police." My mother-in-law looked surprised, as if she thought she could pull it off. "What a wife you are. Are you saying that you would betray me, your own family?" "Don't twist things," I retorted. "We're a family, and we just want to make sure things are right." When I took out my phone, she panicked and rushed towards me. Bob immediately stopped her. "Evidence? You have no evidence. With all this evidence, do we need more? If so, let us provide you with something more conclusive." I pointed towards the roof. My mother-in-law strained her eyes to see, then her face paled. Yes, our house had security cameras installed, and by sheer coincidence, the area around the outlet was within the camera's range. My mother-in-law let out a soft ah in distress. "Is this enough proof?" "Oh, one more thing, is there more? Today was the release date for the limited edition dessert, so you were in a really big hurry, right?" "No way," I flashed her a cheeky smile. "Yes, I had a friend buy it for me, so I was able to secure it safely. If you hadn't been so obsessed with siphoning electricity, you might have been able to buy it online." What a shame. My mother-in-law fell to the ground, trembling and helpless. After talking with Bob, we decided not to report my mother-in-law to the police. She admitted her wrongdoing, and we had evidence, but it was more troublesome than anything. And since she was our family, there was a chance that it would be ignored. Instead, we decided to have my in-laws pay for the electricity used and additional compensation for the inconvenience. Living in close quarters meant things were bound to get awkward, but that determination was necessary for my peace of mind. My in-laws seemed to feel the tension as our interactions decreased. One day, we received some happy news: they were returning to their old house. Apparently, rumors of electricity theft were being spread, and rumors were particularly harsh about my parents-in-law, especially my mother-in-law. She got quite upset and started crying, and she said she wanted to go back to her previous house. By the way, I thought that my mother-in-law had good relations with her neighbors, but it turns out that she did not. She was just being treated like a fragile object. After paying us and the moving expenses, my in-laws were left lamenting that they were out of money. However, we're absolutely not going to help them out. I hope they cut back on their beloved sweets and manage on their own. On the other hand, now that my mother-in-law is gone, I've been living life to the fullest every single day. Our electric bill has significantly reduced, and I'm currently debating which dessert to treat myself to next. I often find myself reflecting on the peculiarities of my life, especially when faced with the incredulous remarks of others. Riding on your parents' coattails at work and now you're just a slacker, right? These words echo in my mind, a constant reminder of the skepticism that surrounds me. At 35 years old, with a husband turning 37, and no children to show for it, I'm often questioned about the trajectory of my life. Why don't you just let go of my child? How on earth did someone like you manage to get married? The skepticism is palpable, as if my existence defies some unwritten rule. My journey into adulthood took a turn after my father's passing 6 years ago. We relocated, my mother, my husband John, and I, seeking solace in a new home. John, a beacon of kindness, seamlessly integrated into our family dynamic, bringing a sense of peace to our home. But my professional life has been a roller coaster of highs and lows. Initially, I followed the expected path, joining my father's company straight out of college. It seemed like the logical choice, after all, my whole family worked there. Electrical engineering, the family business's specialty, became my field of expertise. However, the whispers started the moment I stepped through the company doors. She's only here because of her father. The weight of expectations bore down on me, suffocating any sense of accomplishment. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake off the stigma of nepotism. My brothers, too, faced the same scrutiny but managed to prove themselves through their abilities. Determined not to be left behind, I threw myself into my work, striving to earn recognition based on merit alone. My boss, perhaps sensing the pressure, evaluated my performance with a discerning eye, holding me to higher standards than my peers. And when I finally climbed the ladder of success, earning a well-deserved promotion, it felt bittersweet. Yes, I had proven my worth, but the shadow of doubt still lingered, tarnishing my achievements. Outside of work, my relationship with my mother-in-law and sister-in-law added another layer of complexity. Their disdain for me was thinly veiled, manifesting in snide remarks and slanderous gossip. It was exhausting, to say the least, navigating familial dynamics fraught with tension and hostility. Yet, amidst the skepticism and adversity, I find solace in the unwavering support of my husband John. His belief in me sustains me through the darkest of times, reminding me that my worth extends far beyond the confines of others' perceptions. So, as I continue to navigate the tumultuous waters of life, I hold on to the glimmer of hope that one day, my resilience will silence the doubters, and my achievements will speak for themselves. By whispers that perhaps my promotion was still not fully earned. Despite the professional strides I made, the shadow of nepotism hung heavily over me. My relationship with John, which began during my time at the company, was a bright spot in those days. John worked in a different industry altogether, in marketing, which made our conversations at home a refreshing escape from the electrical engineering world that consumed my family's life. We married after 2 years of dating, a decision that felt like the right step in our solid and supportive relationship. However, my in-laws were another story entirely. From the moment John and I announced our engagement, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law expressed their skepticism about me. "How on earth did someone like you manage to get married?" was a question whispered just loud enough for me to overhear at our wedding. Their attitude was clear, they thought I was not good enough for John. Their coldness was palpable, and their suspicions about my motivations for marrying into their family were hurtful. The accusations didn't stop at personal digs, they spilled over into my professional life as well. Riding on your parents' coattails at work, and now you're just a slacker, right? No kids either, why don't you just let go of my child? My sister-in-law spat during a family gathering, making it clear that she viewed my career changes and my decision not to rush into parenthood as personal failures or, worse, strategic moves to secure a comfortable life through John. Despite these challenges, I tried to maintain a peaceful home life. When my father passed away, John and I moved in with my mother to support her through her grief. John's kindness and his effort to get along with my mother created a tranquil environment at home. His support was a constant reassurance against the backdrop of my tumultuous professional life and the strained relationships with my in-laws. In my professional realm, I eventually left my father's company. The decision was driven by a deep self-reflection about where my passions truly lay. This led me to a smaller, more innovative company in the tech industry where I could work more independently and escape the stigma of nepotism. Here, I found my true calling and began to thrive, leveraging my background in electrical engineering in new and exciting ways. At this new job, I was determined to make my mark independently. The work was challenging, but it was a relief to be evaluated on my own merits rather than my family connections. Slowly but surely, I gained the respect of my new colleagues and established myself as a valuable member of the team. My efforts paid off, and I began to see real progress in my career trajectory. And thriving in my career, something she often uses as ammunition for her remarks. The persistent negativity from my in-laws became a sore point, especially since John and I were building a life together based on mutual respect and love. Despite their harsh views and accusations, John stood by me, always assuring me of his unwavering support and love. He saw my struggles and always encouraged me to focus on our relationship and the life we were building, rather than the disdain from his family. At work, my dedication continued to pay off. I immersed myself in challenging projects and innovative solutions that significantly benefited the company. My efforts were slowly but surely changing some colleagues' perceptions, who started to see me not as the CEO's daughter but as a competent and innovative engineer in my own right. This shift was gradual but noticeable, and it helped to bolster my confidence in an environment that had once been so hostile. However, the rumors and whispers never entirely disappeared. "She's only here because of her father," some would murmur, even as I led successful projects and pushed the company into new technological territories. The dichotomy between my actual performance and the perceptions some held was frustrating and disheartening. Back at home, my relationship with John continued to be my sanctuary. We often spent our evenings discussing books we were reading, planning small trips for weekends, or simply enjoying a quiet evening together. These moments were precious, creating a strong bond that no amount of external negativity could tarnish. As for dealing with my in-laws, I learned to maintain a polite but firm distance. When confronted with snide remarks, I would often respond with grace, though inside, I was struggling not to let the bitterness affect me. "I work hard for what I have, and I am qualified for my position," became a mantra I would silently repeat to myself during these encounters. Despite the difficulties, I found solace in the knowledge that my worth and my achievements were not defined by the misconceptions of others. My true value came from the hard work I put into both my career and my marriage, proving to myself, if no one else, that I was more than capable of succeeding on my own merits. The love and support from John and the recognition I gradually earned at work were the affirmations I needed to continue moving forward. And struggling to handle the mixed emotions of grief and responsibility, the situation at work became almost unbearable. The whispers that were once just irritating now felt like loud accusations, each one like a sharp jab at my already fragile state. People were quick to speculate whether my brother would treat me differently, perhaps even more leniently, which only added to my stress. The dynamic at the office shifted almost overnight. Colleagues who had shown respect for my capabilities began to question my contributions, assuming that any future successes I might have would be attributed to favoritism by my brother. Despite my brother's integrity and his clear stance on meritocracy, the murmurs persisted. It was disheartening to realize that no matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, some would always see me through the lens of nepotism. Home life was my refuge, yet even that was tinged with the stress brought on by my interactions with my in-laws. The constant jibes from my sister-in-law, coupled with the subtle digs from my mother-in-law, began to weigh heavily on me. Their facade of civility would vanish the moment we were away from public eyes, replaced by cold stares and whispered criticisms. Despite the support from John, who saw the toll these interactions were taking on me and often stood up in my defense, the familial tension was a continuous drain on my well-being. During one particularly tense visit, I decided to confront the issue head-on. After a particularly harsh comment from my sister-in-law about my professional life, I calmly explained how her perceptions were not only hurtful but fundamentally misguided. "I've earned my place through hard work and dedication, just as anyone else at any company should," I said firmly, maintaining eye contact. "The assumptions you make not only undermine my efforts, but also insult the professional integrity of those who work with me, including your brother." The room fell silent. It was one of the few times I addressed the issue so directly, and while it did not immediately change her behavior, it felt empowering to stand up for myself. In these challenging times, my personal projects became a sanctuary. I delved deeper into the tech innovations I was passionate about, often working late into the night on new ideas that could potentially revolutionize aspects of our business. These projects not only helped me regain a sense of control over my professional life, but also provided a much-needed distraction from the emotional chaos of my personal interactions. As I navigated through these complexities, my love for John and my passion for my work acted as my beacons, guiding me through the stormy weather of family drama and workplace challenges. While the road was rough, and the journey far from over, I found strength in my accomplishments and solace in the arms of my husband, hopeful that with time, understanding, and patience, I could turn these adversities into stepping stones for personal growth and professional respect. It wasn't always steady. The transition from a well-established career in electrical engineering to the unpredictable world of writing was daunting, yet profoundly liberating. Each day brought its own set of challenges and triumphs, but the fulfillment I felt from creating something entirely my own was incomparable. My typical day involved a disciplined routine. I would wake up early, sometimes before dawn, when the world was still quiet, to write. This quiet time became my most productive and creative period. The stories I wrote were often inspired by the snippets of life I had experienced or imagined, enriched by the extensive reading I had always loved. Finding my voice as a writer took time. I experimented with various genres, from mystery to science fiction, and even dabbled in some non-fiction, drawing on my technical background when it felt right. The feedback from early readers was mixed, but every piece of criticism was a tool for improvement. I learned to cherish constructive feedback as it pushed me to refine my craft further. My husband, John, was incredibly supportive. He read my drafts, offered feedback, and encouraged me when I doubted myself. His belief in my potential as a writer bolstered my confidence. "You have a unique voice," he would say, "and your stories are captivating. Keep going." His support was not just emotional but practical too. He helped me set up a small home office, which became my sanctuary, filled with books and notes, where I could write undisturbed. The struggle to gain recognition in the literary world was real. I faced numerous rejections from publishers and literary agents, which was disheartening. However, I persisted, reminding myself that many successful authors faced similar setbacks in their early careers. I attended writers' workshops, joined online forums, and networked with other writers, which not only improved my writing but also slowly built a network of contacts who could help me navigate the industry. Gradually, my efforts began to pay off. I published a few short stories in literary magazines, and eventually, one of my novels caught the eye of a small but respected publisher. The moment I held the first printed copy of my book was indescribable, a mix of disbelief and pride. It was a modest success, but a success nonetheless, validating my decision to change careers. Through writing, I found not just a profession but a passion that resonated deeply with my soul. It healed the wounds inflicted by years of corporate battles and familial misunderstandings. Writing gave me a voice that no one could discredit or undermine. It was mine alone, earned through persistence, creativity, and the courage to follow a path less traveled. Each story I penned brought me closer to understanding myself and the world around me, providing a sense of accomplishment and peace that I had never experienced in my previous career. As I sat down to write another chapter of my latest novel, the weight of the words from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law echoed in my mind, undercutting my focus. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, to this point of being a successful novelist, despite their skepticism and disparaging remarks. Initially, my decision to pursue writing full-time was met with raised eyebrows and doubt, even from those closest to me, except for my staunch allies, my mother and my husband. Starting out, the transition wasn't smooth. My income was negligible, making me feel insecure and doubtful of my own abilities. However, with perseverance, the tides began to turn in the fourth year of my career when one of my novels not only won an award but was also published. This milestone marked a significant turn in my career trajectory, enabling me to secure a contract with a reputable publishing house. The stability this contract brought was a game changer, providing me with a consistent flow of projects and significantly easing my financial instability. By the fifth year, propelled by the success of a hit novel, my earnings surpassed even my husband's substantial salary. This achievement wasn't just a personal victory, it was a vindication against the doubts cast by others about my career choice. My work began to be adapted into various formats, comics and television dramas, further solidifying my reputation in the literary community. This expansion kept me incredibly busy, but ensured that my income remained steady and growing. Despite the external success, the journey was fraught with personal challenges and naysayers, particularly from my in-laws. After the passing of my father-in-law, their remarks grew even more pointed and harsh. They saw me spending days on end at home, writing and researching, and labeled me a nerd, using the term derogatorily to imply that I was out of touch and lazy. Their jealousy was palpable, especially regarding the luxurious high-rise condo I lived in, a property that, unbeknownst to them, came from my own inheritance, not my husband's earnings. This misconception about my financial contribution to our household persisted despite my best efforts to clarify the situation. My in-laws remained convinced that I was financially dependent on my husband, a notion that gnawed at me. Their unyielding stance and behind-the-back comments were a source of considerable stress, yet I bore them silently, choosing not to confront the issue directly in an effort to maintain peace. Amidst this familial strife, another personal worry plagued me, the issue of not having children. Turning 30 had triggered unsolicited comments about starting a family, and now at 35, the pressure and remarks had intensified. My husband and I had hoped for children, but it hadn't happened yet, and the constant reminders from my in-laws only added to the stress. Throughout these challenges, the unwavering support from my mother and husband was my rock. They both encouraged me to focus on my passion and to overlook the negativity as much as possible. In times of overwhelming criticism, I sought their counsel, which provided me with the strength to continue. Their belief in me bolstered my resolve to persevere, to prove not just to my critics but to myself that I had made the right choice in following my dream, no matter the obstacles. Reflecting on past difficulties and determined not to repeat them, I made a conscious decision to address issues with my in-laws more proactively. Learning from my previous job experience, where I had bottled up my frustrations until I reached a breaking point, I realized the importance of early intervention. However, knowing the delicate nature of familial relations, especially since my in-laws maintained a facade of decency around my husband, I chose to discuss these matters with him in the gentlest terms possible. "You don't need to get involved directly, I'll handle our interactions," I assured him, hoping to shield him from unnecessary conflict while keeping him informed. My husband, aware of my previous emotional turmoil caused by the backbiting, became a protective buffer. He managed our interactions to minimize my exposure to their snide remarks, and his efforts did make a difference. Although their malice occasionally seeped through, causing me distress, the knowledge that I had staunch allies in my husband and my mother helped me recover my spirits swiftly. Concerning the matter of children, my mother, who had experienced motherhood later in life, offered comforting words, "There's no need to rush. It's just not the right time yet. I had you later in my life, so there's no reason to worry." Her reassurance gave me peace, allowing me to approach the issue with less urgency, despite the ongoing pressure from my in-laws. With my current workload and the persistent negativity from them, I felt that adding the responsibility of a child might be too much. This decision, while difficult, was one I had come to terms with, choosing to focus on maintaining my mental stability and nurturing my career. Living in the well-designed, strategically located house left to us by my father provided a sanctuary. My husband, mother, and I enjoyed a relatively peaceful existence. The house's amenities, including gym equipment and a dedicated workspace in the shared facilities, allowed me to maintain a healthy balance between work and personal life, aiding significantly in managing stress. However, tranquility was abruptly shattered the day my vibrant and seemingly healthy mother collapsed and passed away from a stroke. She had been her usual energetic self that morning, and I had cheerfully waved her off, never suspecting it would be our last goodbye. The shock was profound. I was utterly unprepared for the news when I arrived at the hospital to find that she had already passed. Seeing her there, appearing as if she had merely fallen asleep, sent waves of disbelief coursing through me. It didn't seem real. As I went through the motions of arranging her funeral, the reality of her absence slowly sank in, and in the quiet moments that followed, I finally allowed myself to grieve deeply for the loss of my dear mother. I decided to channel my grief into the one thing that had always brought me comfort and purpose, writing. Despite the aching loss that enveloped me, I knew that burying myself in my work would be a tribute to her memory, considering how much she had always supported and believed in my passion. So, with a heavy heart but a determined spirit, I resumed my routine, sitting at my desk surrounded by the familiar clutter of notes and manuscripts. The quiet of the house, once filled with my mother's presence, now seemed deafening, each tick of the clock a stark reminder of her absence. Yet, as I began to type, each word steadied me slightly more than the last. Writing had a way of anchoring me, pulling me back from the brink of my emotions, offering a semblance of normalcy amidst the turmoil. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law's earlier words at the funeral lingered unpleasantly in the back of my mind. Their crass insinuations about my dependency on my mother and their stingy attitude toward the condolence money were hard to shake off. However, I consciously chose to set aside those thoughts during my writing hours, focusing on the characters and plots that needed to be fleshed out rather than dwelling on their cruelty. The challenge was not just emotional, but also professional. The deadline was looming, and I had promised the publishing house to deliver on time. They had been accommodating, understanding the personal crisis I was dealing with, but I knew I couldn't rely on their patience indefinitely. My mother had always taught me the importance of responsibility and the value of keeping one's word, principles I intended to uphold in her honor. As I worked, I found a strange comfort in the world I created on paper. It was a world where I had control, where the characters might suffer, triumph, or find peace, guided by the strokes of my pen. This control was a stark contrast to the helplessness I felt in managing my grief or changing the attitudes of my in-laws. With each passing day, the manuscript began to take shape, and with it, a small part of the void left by my mother's passing was filled. The act of creating, of putting thoughts and emotions into words, was therapeutic. It allowed me to express my sorrow in a way that was both productive and healing. Even as I missed her terribly, I could almost feel my mother's encouragement, urging me on, proud of my resilience and dedication. In these moments, the connection I felt to her was as strong as it had ever been, a testament to the enduring influence she had on my life, both in her presence and now, profoundly, in her absence. Attempting to calm the surreal situation that had suddenly descended upon us, my husband took the lead, his voice firm yet controlled. Firstly, the condo isn't mine. It was inherited by Karen from her father, not from her mother, and certainly not from me, he clarified, aiming to correct their misguided assumptions once and for all. And Karen isn't just lounging around at home, she's a successful novelist, a profession that requires just as much dedication and hard work as any other. The diner's ambient noise seemed to dim as we faced off across the table, the absurdity of the situation making it almost seem like a bizarre dream. The insistence from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law that they had rights to move into my home was not only inappropriate but completely baseless. They continued to argue their point with a confidence that was both infuriating and pitiful. It's logical for us to live there. Now that your mother is gone, Karen, the house should serve the family, my sister-in-law added, as if this explained everything. As they laid out their deluded plans, I felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside me, anger, disbelief, and an unexpected surge of resolve. The mention of my mother and their dismissive reference to me as a nerd were particularly painful, but these jabs also fortified my resolve not to let their ignorance and greed disrupt the life I had built. We need to clear up a few things, I said, my voice steady, despite the churn of emotions. First, this house is my property, legally left to me by my father. It has nothing to do with my husband's finances or my mother's past contributions. Secondly, you are not entitled to decide where you live based on whims or unfounded claims. My husband nodded, supporting each point. Moreover, moving in with us is not an option. This isn't just about ownership, it's about respecting our lives and the choices we make as a family, which right now involves just Karen and myself. They looked taken aback, perhaps not expecting such a firm resistance or clear explanation of the facts. The idea that they could simply claim ownership and disrupt our lives was met with a definitive boundary that my husband and I presented unitedly. As we finished our drinks, the initial shock of their proposal gave way to a clearer perspective on how to handle the situation. We agreed that further discussions would be necessary, to involve legal advice if needed, to ensure that boundaries were respected and that such absurd demands would not surface again. Leaving the diner, my husband squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance of his unwavering support and love. As we headed home, the earlier grief and shock began to settle into a quiet determination. Whatever challenges might come, we would face them together, standing firm against any who would disrupt the peace and stability we cherished in our lives. Hearing their predicament only added to the absurdity of the situation. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law had acted so impulsively, selling their own home under the assumption they could just move into ours without consent. It was reckless, and now they were in a real bind. They had appended their own lives, based on a fantastical plan that hadn't been grounded in any reality. I stood there, astounded by the sheer irresponsibility of their actions. It was difficult to muster sympathy for the self-inflicted predicament they found themselves in. They looked at us with wide, pleading eyes, desperation evident in their voices as they implored us to reconsider, to let them move in with us to save face, and because they had nowhere else to go. My husband, visibly shaken by the revelation and their brazenness, stood his ground. This is not just about a place to stay. This is about respect and boundaries. You made a decision without consulting us, assuming you could just take over our lives and our home. That's not acceptable, he declared with a firmness that left no room for ambiguity. The air around us was tense, the earlier commotion at the diner now seeming trivial compared to the drama unfolding before us. I could see the panic set in deeper as they realized the gravity of their mistake. My sister-in-law, having quit her job in anticipation of a new life in our condo, was particularly distressed. Despite the turmoil they had caused, there was a part of me that understood the direness of their situation. "Look," I said, trying to inject some reason into the conversation, "you can't stay with us. That's not going to happen. But we will help you find a temporary place until you sort this out." My offer was more generous than I felt, given their earlier insults and assumptions. Yet, it was important to me that we handle this situation with as much grace and dignity as possible, despite their lack of the same. My husband nodded in agreement, relieved that I was taking a compassionate stance. "We'll help you look for rentals starting tomorrow. You can stay in a hotel for a few nights, on us, until you find something more permanent." Their faces showed a mix of relief and embarrassment. They had expected anger and outright rejection, but here we were, offering a lifeline, despite everything. It was clear this was not the resolution they had hoped for, but it was the one they had to accept. As we wrapped up our discussion, the weight of their misjudgment and our decision to help nonetheless was palpable. We left the diner not with the closeness that familial ties should bring, but with a clear delineation of respect and personal boundaries. It was a sobering reminder of the complexities of family dynamics and the importance of clear communication and mutual respect. With the discovery of my pregnancy, a profound sense of peace and purpose enveloped me. Despite the recent turmoil caused by my in-laws, the news of the new life growing inside me filled my days with renewed energy and focus. This glimmer of hope was like a beacon in the fog, guiding me through the remnants of the familial storm. I was determined to create a nurturing environment for my child, one filled with love and security, much like the one my own mother had provided for me. As I moved forward, balancing the anticipation of motherhood with my writing, I became even more invested in my characters and stories. Writing had always been a refuge, but now it took on a deeper significance. It was not only a profession, but also a legacy I hoped to pass on to my child, the value of creativity and hard work. However, the tranquility of my daily routine was still occasionally disrupted by attempts from my in-laws to reconnect. Their messages, filled with pleas and apologies, continued to flood our phones and emails. After consulting with my husband, who had steadfastly supported my decision to block their numbers, we maintained our stance of minimal contact. It was a necessary boundary to protect our growing family and our mental well-being. Their situation, as they relayed through various messages before being blocked, became increasingly dire. The reality of their hastily made decision to sell their family home and the subsequent challenges of living in a less desirable apartment, compounded by the difficulty of finding steady employment, painted a clear picture of their desperation. They were scraping by, working multiple part-time jobs, a far cry from the comfortable life they had envisioned at our expense. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. They had mocked me for my career as a novelist, seeing it as unstable and insubstantial, yet here I was, thriving and expanding my family, while they struggled with the repercussions of their own misguided actions. This contrast only solidified my resolve to focus on my own family's future rather than dwell on their misfortunes. As I moved further along in my pregnancy, the excitement about the baby grew. I found myself often touching my belly, whispering words of love and encouragement to my unborn child. The connection I felt was indescribable, a mix of awe, excitement, and a bit of nervousness about the kind of mother I would be. I wanted to provide my child with the same strength and inspiration my mother had given me, ensuring they always felt safe and loved. Continuing my work as a novelist, I channeled my experiences into my writing, enriching my narratives with the depth of my own emotional journeys. The challenges I had faced with my in-laws, though painful, had given me a new perspective on family dynamics, which I wove into my stories, adding layers of realism and empathy. As I looked forward to the arrival of my baby, my life felt like a book with its pages still being written, a story of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family I was eager to build with my husband and our child. With each day, I grew more excited about the future, grateful for the peace that had returned to our lives, and the endless possibilities that